3. So let's begin, and people can join us as they get here. So once again, my name is Amy Janess. I'm programming coordinator for the Nantucket Atheneum, the public library on the island of Nantucket in Massachusetts. And I just want to say thank you for coming and welcome. Before I do a little brief intro, I just would like to say that at the conclusion of the discussion tonight, Nat and Peter will take your questions. So as we go along, or if we get to the end and you think of a question, please type it in the Q&A or the chat. We'll keep an eye on both. You'll find at the bottom of your screen icons that say Q&A and chat, and just click on that and type your question. We are being recorded tonight, so if you want to watch it again or share it with your friends, you can find the video recording on the Nantucket Atheneum's YouTube channel if you just go to YouTube and search for Nantucket Atheneum. So here's just a very brief introduction for our speakers tonight. I am thrilled that they're going to actually let you know more. So let me just say Nat Philbrick is the author of 12 books, including the basis of tonight's discussion, Travels with George, which came out in September. He and his wife, Melissa, and their dog moved, he and his wife, Melissa, moved to Nantucket in 1986. Nat published his first book, Away Offshore, in 1998. And in 2000, his New York Times bestseller, In the Heart of the Sea, won the National Book Award for Nonfiction. He's the founding director of Nantucket's Egan Maritime Institute, a research fellow at the Nantucket Historical Association, and a board member for the Nantucket Atheneum. And Peter Panchy taught history and was also an administrator at Nantucket High School for 28 years. He earned his undergraduate degree from Harvard University and his master's degree in education from Lesley University. So Nat and Peter, welcome and take it away.
Okay. I'd like to start by giving a very open-ended question to Nat. He and I have talked over the years, and we shared an opinion that George Washington was very much underappreciated. People say, he won the American Revolution, so we kind of rewarded him by making him president, and what a great guy. If we think about all he risked by, the resignation after winning the war, presiding officer of the Constitutional Convention, and taking on the presidency when he knew full well the importance and pressure of the precedence that the first presidency would take. So I wasn't at all surprised that Nat put George as one of his projects. However, this book is so different and includes personal observations, his wife, Melissa, his dog, Dora. So I just thought it would be good for all of us to hear kind of the origins of how this project came together and what the goals and aims were. Take it away, Nat.
Well, thank you, Peter. And Peter, I have to say, knows this book pretty well because he was one of my readers when it was in manuscript form. And so thank you, Peter. Your comments were a huge help. Well, this is a different book for me. And it really started for me in 2017 when I was finishing up my third book about the American Revolution, In the Hurricane's Eye, which deals with the year of Yorktown. And I had spent 10 years writing about the revolution, 2 more years than it actually took to fight it. It was really a long-term but exhilarating experience to dig in that deep into a single topic. But I was kind of exhausted. I needed a change. For 25 years, I'd been writing about America's history. I live on Nantucket. I've been in this basement office you see for all of that time. And I wanted to get out and actually see the country I'd been writing about. And I also just needed to do something different. I needed to mix it up. And it was during a late inning research trip to Providence that I went to the John Brown House in Providence, Rhode Island. This is not John Brown, the abolitionist. This is John Brown, one of the founders of Brown University. And he has this brick magisterial house that many people claimed he based some of the details on Mount Vernon. He was a big fan of George Washington. And if you visit this house, which is now owned by the Rhode Island Historical Society, in the back is John Brown's carriage, his chariot. And according to family tradition, John Brown took George Washington, the newly inaugurated president, on a ride out to see his shipyard where he was building a ship named for Washington. And I went, well, what is a President Washington doing in Providence? I knew he had been there several times as a general. What was going on? And that's when I learned about the fact that when Washington became president, he realized he was the leader of an already politically divided country. The Constitution had divided the country into those who supported the Constitution and the strong federal government it created, and what were known as the anti-federalists, who opposed, who distrusted a strong national government and felt the state should retain the power they had had under the original Articles of Confederation. And so, two states, including Rhode Island and North Carolina, had not even ratified the Constitution when Washington was inaugurated president. He felt he needed to do something to pull this country together. So he set out on a road trip. And I thought, wow, he went on a series of road trips to try to unite this country. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to follow George Washington? And as it so happened, my wife, Melissa, was in the process of retiring from her job as the head of Remain Nantucket, a nonprofit on the island. We would have some time available for the two of us to travel together. And one of my favorite books of all time is John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie. It's just, Steinbeck getting in his pickup truck with his standard poodle Charlie in search of the meaning of America. And I thought, well, what if Melissa and I, because we had a new puppy named Dora, a Nova Scotia duck-tolling retriever, what if Melissa and I and Dora got into our Honda Pilot and followed Washington? It seemed like, we are now at a time of what's always being called unprecedented political division. What if we followed Washington at this time to see, to get a historical perspective on today's situation by following the president as he tried to unite the country at the very beginning of our history? And so off we went. And as you said, Peter, it's a different kind of book. I really wanted to change it up. I wanted a more informal voice. I wanted to talk about not only what we saw, but some of my own background to hopefully inform it, talk about what was happening with Melissa and Dora and I as we stayed in all these dog-friendly hotels, but also interweave that story with what Washington experienced. And so it was a challenging but really fun book to write. And it was, for me, a much needed change of pace in terms of narrative and just changing it up. And so it was really fun.
Well, I even though I already knew you, I really found it a lot of fun hearing the personal sides of things. And of course, those of us who know and love you kind of agree with your mother when she asks you, when are you going to grow up?
Yes. That was one. My father is still with us. He's 92. And he's in the book. He grew up in Providence. And when Washington visited Providence, he visited what's now Brown University. It was then known as Rhode Island College. And so I felt like if Melissa and I are going to Providence, we got to go with my dad. And so we drove down there. My dad was riding shotgun. Melissa and Dora were in the back. And we toured my dad's old haunts in Providence while following Washington. And so it was, inevitably, I talk about him, as you said, my mother, who did it when I was 40 and asked me when I was going to grow up. And as you indicate, a lot of people are still asking that.
It's a wonderful part of you. No embarrassment there. I was struck, and what one of my reactions immediately is of course it's about unity.
Right.
But it didn't occur to me, and I hadn't shared this with you before. I hadn't connected with Mayflower. How important unity and putting differences aside was to the very survival of our first northern colony. And I had to bring that up.
And it's a really good point. And this is where I guess we're now in the 401 anniversary. But I've been talking and I talked at the Atheneum about the Mayflower with you a year ago. And it's a story I've been talking about. And you're right. There were two different groups on the Mayflower, what we call the Pilgrims, and then the strangers, and who didn't share their beliefs. And it was going in a bad direction as they were approaching the coast of Cape Cod, because they weren't supposed to be there. And so everybody was caught off guard. And a lot of the strangers said, we're on our own. We're not going to go with the rest of you. But instead of, a fist fight, they came up with the Mayflower Compact. And, this is a theme in America, because here we are in the late 18th century. We have the Constitution, but we are still a divided country. And, and Washington, I don't think Washington would be surprised by the divisions we have today. He would experience them later in his administration. And this is the great challenge of our democracy, is there are two parties. It's a huge nation. And people don't always disagree. And yet, if we don't have the Union, which was Washington's great obsession, was we have to think as a nation, a union of states. If we're going to have a successful government that oversees all of us in our diversity, we have to agree on certain ground rules. And one of them is a civil government of laws. Mm-hmm. And I think if Washington was magically transported here today, he would not be surprised by the political divisions, but he would be greatly distressed by our contemporary attempts to undermine people's faith in government. Because once you kick that out from underneath a democracy, you destroy it doesn't work anymore. And
I would say very much so, and compromise. I think it's chapter 14 when you are talking about the busts at Monticello, and I correct me if I'm misquoting you, but I think you said it was one of, if not George Washington's greatest frustration, that these two men who he, with such differing views,
Jefferson and Hamilton,
that he brought into his cabinet to try to show that we are all Americans. We need to have all the voices, yet they could not compromise enough. And I think the quote you use is to get the work done. And I look at our government now, and there's so many issues like compromise and unity that you touch on in his travels that are so current and important today.
And that was what was kind of exciting and terrifying as well when I was working on this book, because, we finished our travels just before the pandemic hit. And then, there was, this movement for social justice. And, many of the Confederate statues we had seen in the South were tumbling down. And, the ground seemed to be moving under our feet. But as I was writing the book, I realized this gave me as an author a tremendous sense of urgency, that the issues, just as you said, the issues Washington was grappling with are right here with us today. And this goes with a country that was born in a revolution. We are a democracy. Each generation has to struggle with the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, that all of us are created equal. And it's not pretty, it's often ugly, but it requires people to communicate and to compromise. And as you said, Washington, Abraham Lincoln did not invent a team of rivals. Washington really did, because by bringing in Hamilton, who was a Federalist, and Jefferson, who was very much an anti-Federalist, into this same cabinet, you were just asking for it. And sure enough, by the middle of his first term, the two of them, there was virtual warfare between them. And the letters Washington would write them is, if you're finding yourself at such a difference of opinion with someone, maybe you should start to wonder, well, maybe I've pushed it too far. Maybe a middle course, and this is what he says, maybe a middle course is the right path to follow. Mm-hmm. And of course, Hamilton and Jefferson, who both thought they were the smartest people in the world, and they were probably pretty close to right, refused to compromise. It was their way or the highway. And that's what distinguishes Washington. Yes, he was a Federalist because he was for the Constitution and a strong national government, but he wanted to make things work. He didn't have a philosophical or political hobby horse that he had to ride the way Jefferson and Hamilton did. He was willing to compromise for the good of the nation, for the good of the Union.
But, in some ways, though, I think they pass an ultimate test. In a sense, and this is not discussed in the book, but in the election of 1800, when Burr and Jefferson tie,
right,
and Hamilton encourages enough Federalists to vote for Jefferson because he feels that Burr's character is not to the quality that our nation needs to succeed. So he'd rather see his arch rival, who will put the nation first rather than anything else. And again, I think that hits a note today that, I'll speak for myself, strikes fear into me. We are so divided. For instance, it's not just partisan politics that can't compromise. Within the Democratic Party, they can't compromise enough to get much needed infrastructure through.
Right. No, it's the perennial problem. And, Washington, the thing is, why not even George Washington was able to cure partisanship. By his second term, he was deeply distressed by the political infighting. And it was awful. It was as bad as today, highly personal, all these invectives being thrown around. So not even Washington was able to cure that. But once again, it's ultimately what he was able to do during his travels and in the presidential mansion, was to create a sense of legitimacy for a new national government. And that is extraordinary because there was no one else in America who could have done it. If it had been John Adams, who became the next president, he was too associated with the Federalists in New England to convince the South that this presidency would have been a good idea. And if it had been Jefferson, the same thing with the North. And so what was unique about Washington was he was a Southerner. He was born on the Potomac in Virginia, but his experience during the Revolution had taught him how disastrous a weak federal government was. The Continental Congress had no taxation ability when it came to the country, and so they were hopeless. And we almost lost the revolution, not because of the battlefield, but because we had such a dysfunctional civil government. And so Washington realized we have to do something here. And he wasn't the only one, of course. And so that led to the Constitutional Convention. And so Washington is someone who has seen America in its darkest times during the Revolution, experienced firsthand the frustrations of dysfunction. The only reason we got through the 8 years of war was because he was there somehow holding together this relatively minuscule Continental Army and able to outlast the greatest military power on earth, Great Britain. We didn't win the revolution. We just outlasted them. And, and that's, and that was one of the insights for me once I had done with my trilogy, was Washington didn't win the revolution. He survived the revolution. And no one else in America or the world, I think, could have done that given the frustrations he experienced.
Yeah, I think there were few people who had that sense that we win by not losing. I'm never going to risk a final epic battle. It's a matter of staying in the field somewhere.
Yeah, and staying in the field was something he brought to the presidency. And I think his whole decision to go on a tour was kind of extraordinary. I mean, it wouldn't be done again for another 30 years. And this was someone he's inventing the presidency. But he also can see from the very beginning, there's this huge risk of him becoming isolated. And so what does he do when Congress goes into recess? Most people who were president would have said, well, finally, I can go home and relax. He hits the road and goes on his New England tour and all the rest. And this is someone for whom travel was just part of his being. As a teenager, he surveyed the western wilds of Virginia and Pennsylvania. As a general in the Revolution, he crisscrossed the country. Even as a plantation owner, he spent typically 6 hours a day in the saddle, inspecting the 8,000 acres of Mount Vernon. This was someone who didn't want to be stuck in an office. And so, this road trip was, I think, saved him as much as it did the country.
Yes, and as much as he wanted to do it, another thing I think your book points out is this is the 1790s. This travel is arduous. George is not a young athletic man that he was during the war. Obviously, the personal sacrifices he makes, but this is so important to him. He goes through incredible discomfort.
Absolutely.
To do this.
Yeah, no, this was no, high five session. Okay, let's put the New England tour. The New England tour, he would visit 60 towns. And Washington was not a backslapper, but he had a sense of the dramatic. He loved to go to plays, and after 8 years as leader of the Continental Army, he knew how to make an impression. And so remember, he was not traveling by Air Force One. He was traveling by horse-drawn carriage with, with 6 other people, basically, no security detail. And so to make as big an impression on the people as he could, he knew he was the most famous person in the world at this point. And how could he use that fame to create the office of the presidency, something that would outlast him? And so he had developed this routine. Before he entered a town, he'd slip out of his carriage, dressed in his Revolutionary War uniform, there's gold epaulets on each shoulder. He was a tall man. He was between 6'2" and 6'4" tall, which is huge in the late 18th century. And he'd get on his great big white horse and ride down Main Street, and the people would go crazy. And, this was and what this created was a sense of national pride that really had not yet existed. But as you said, but Washington also, he wanted to make an impression, but he also wanted to make it very clear that he was one of the people, that, he was, yes, he might be the most famous person in the world, but he was one of them. He was a leader of a republic. So he insisted at the very beginning that as a matter of policy, he would not stay in private homes. He would not stay in the mansions of his rich friends. There would be no favorites during these tours. He would stay only in public taverns. Now, today we think of a historic tavern, we think of a B&B where, you get waffles in the morning and it's all just very nice. These were not B&Bs. These were the roadside motels of his day. Flea infested, dirty, terrible beds, worse food. There's a good thing there wasn't TripAdvisor back then, because Washington would record in his diary, this, typical thing was, my horses stayed in a better quarters than I did. The food was inedible, these kinds of things.
Yeah.
But he felt he had to do this. And so this was arduous. This was not staying in plush suites and being, serenaded everywhere he went. This was hard physical labor.
Yeah. And the quality of the roads. I also like the little story you told about Washington dripped here.
Yes. Well, one of the statements that Steinbeck makes in Travels with Charlie is, we do not take a trip takes us. That it's the unexpected things that really are the most important. And that's absolutely the case for us. And we were Washington's most ambitious and toughest tour was the South. It almost 2,000 miles, took them all the way to Savannah, Georgia, took 3 months, and the roads were terrible in New England. They were worse in the South. And early on, after leaving Mount Vernon, he had to cross the Occoquan River. And Melissa and I were following Washington, and our first major stop was going to be Fredericksburg. And I had made this arrangement to meet with the head of the Mary Washington House. This is Washington's mother's house, and she was going to show us all these places. And I was concentrating on that. But before that, we needed to stop and have some lunch. So we stopped in Occoquan, a kind of small artsy town right on the river. And we go into this very nice restaurant, open up our menus, and Melissa points out that in the bottom, it says of the menu, there's a picture of George Washington, and it says, Washington dripped here. And she said, do you know anything about this? And I said, sounds like I should. And then I read the thing, and I go, oh my gosh, I totally forgot. The most important, one of the most life and death defying parts of the tour was when Washington crossed the Occoquan River on a ferry. His carriage and his 4 horses and the baggage wagon were all in this ferry. They're making their way across when one of his horses bolts in fear and jumps off the ferry, drags the other horses off, and soon the carriage is about to go into the drink. This is terrible. And luckily they get to shore and crisis averted. But according to tradition, Washington ended up in the drink. And this was quite near where this restaurant was. And the ferry keeper lived in this house. And so the tradition in this restaurant was that Washington maybe came to this house to dry off. And so did Washington drip here? He didn't. But yeah, this is just the kind of adventures we had on the road following George.
I don't know if you saw the message from one of our participants here, who of course is begging to see Dora. We all know who the true star of this is. We don't have time to really touch on all the issues that you bring up
That's why you have to get the book. Yeah.
Absolutely, got to go buy it.
Yeah.
But I didn't know if there are any, and you can pick one or two. I have my favorite, which I'll put last. But you got state power versus federal power, and again, I guess I just want to get back to this notion of character. I'm always annoyed with red and blue states because I think it's a television creation. Two of the most important people who really made our federal government were Virginia Federalists. I mean, I'd say Washington and Marshall, who, because of their character, were accepted and listened to, although they were not in step with all their neighbors, certainly. And I think we need to, if we're ever going to have a sense of unity, realize that this red-blue is nonsense, that the reddest state has blue people and the bluest states have plenty of red people.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things Washington said to the former governor of Virginia, who was not for the Constitution, he said, differences of political opinion are necessary. They are, they're like, we have different faces, we have different opinions. The important thing is to talk civilly about our differences. And that's it. Is to talk about it, discuss it, not, rant, not, go to the moral high ground and insist that your way or the highway. This is how you create dysfunction. And so Washington recognized that, and it was the great despair of his life that within his own cabinet, this couldn't happen. And just show you how bad it was. When Washington was finishing up his Southern tour, his own Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and the Virginia Congressman James Madison go on their own Northern tour. And as Jefferson writes to Washington, is for his health. Well, what he didn't say was they were visiting the new state of Vermont. And what Jefferson does not reveal is that they're actually using this to organize the political resistance, what will become the Republican Party. Here Washington is at the end of this arduous group of journeys in which he's trying to unite the country, even as his own Secretary of State is undermining, that quest for unity. And, this speaks to where we are today. Some things change, some things don't change. What I think is and you alluded to it, it comes down to character. And, we can have our differences, but let's just keep talking about it.
And character, you used the word civility. Of course, it's derived from the Roman word for citizens, kiwes. That's, in other words, if you're a citizen, you've got to do a give and take. And we seem to have lost that notion for sure. In Rhode Island, you talk about Washington's views on government and religion. You talk a lot about his personal struggles with slavery. You talk about so many things that remain so important to us. The treatment of the people native to this land.
Right.
I know we're going to have to stop in another 4 or 5 minutes. But are there one or two of those you'd like to comment upon from Washington?
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. Because yes, what and I alluded to it earlier. This was Washington was struggling with the same things we are struggling with, and I really wanted to go as deeply as I could into his relationship with slavery, because that is one of those key factors for us today when we're trying to understand where we came from. And one of the things I want readers, I hope they come to appreciate, is how far Washington traveled, not just in miles across the country, but as a human being. I mean, this is a guy who at age 11 inherits several enslaved people when his father dies. And so, he is a slave owner at age 11. But the revolution would change him. He would see that African-American soldiers were just as brave and hardworking as anyone in his army. He befriended Lafayette, that great idealistic Frenchman who would later say that if he realized he was helping to create a land of slavery, he never would have lifted his sword in the cause of American liberty. And, Washington begins to realize that slavery will undermine the Union. And and he's quoted as saying that. At one point, Jefferson records that Washington being overheard saying in a cabinet meeting, "If slavery should ever divide this country, I will go with the northern part," which is an extraordinary statement from a Virginian. And yet, yes, Washington would free his enslaved workers upon his death, but it would be upon his death. He would be a slaveholder all his life. Even while he was drafting the will that would free those enslaved workers, he was actively pursuing one of Martha's enslaved servants, Ona Judge, who had fled to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And so how to reconcile Washington's, behavior in this regard with his behavior as far as freeing his own enslaved workers. It's complex. And Washington did something extraordinary in that he came to question the preconceptions he grew up with, and that he did not completely free himself of those preconceptions is true. But it's also true that he believed with all his soul in his flawed capacity as who he was in the Union, the very concept that Abraham Lincoln would move Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And so when it comes to Washington and these issues, I think, you have to look at the totality of it, but you also have to realize, yes, he was not perfect by any means. Some of his conduct is reprehensible by modern standards. And yet his belief in the Union is what I think makes him a figure for which we will all, he has to be considered, because we would not be this country without him.
Well, as you said, complexity, sometimes even contradictory.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, you talk about when he does do his will, it gets challenged by members of his family who don't want to lose.
Yep, absolutely. His friends in the South, after he died and it became public, he had done this, roundly criticized him, saying, that these African-American enslaved people were not ready to be free. But the fact of the matter is that group would become the core of a free Black community in Fairfax County that was absolutely unique in the South prior to the American Revolution. Why this was not just a symbolic gesture on Washington's part. This had tangible benefits to this community, to Fairfax County, and the people that had been his enslaved workers. So it's you can't give Washington a free pass.
No,
But and we shouldn't, and that was kind of what I really wanted to look at it in all of its ugly truths, and yet at some point you have to realize at the beginning we were what we are, today we are what we are, and we wouldn't be here if there hadn't been an attempt at the very beginning to create the Union.
Absolutely. And he sacrificed so much, and of course he didn't want to do a second term, but it is clearly his fear of disunity that causes him to go forward and really suffer some of the worst insults to his character and his very being as the partisanship really grows.
No, and it's sad. It really is because
Yep.
because everyone knew the partisanship divide was splitting apart as Washington's finishing up his first term. He just wants out of there. But even Jefferson says to him, "You've got to stay in because anyone else, it's all going to just blow up. You've got to just, stay in there." And so it was a miserable 4 years that followed. There was no accolade. He didn't feel like, he didn't get that sense of, yes, I've created a nation that will endure.
Mm-hmm.
He left, miserable and bitter, and yet, it's only now that we can look back and see the legacy of what he had created.
Absolutely, and we got to leave some time for the people who've been patiently listening
Sure.
to me get you going here. But before we turn it over to Amy, I just wanted to say, I know you're already working on a project about the gold rush, especially related to clipper ships and other aspects. But I want to put in a big push to try to get you to maybe we should start talking about all that Washington says in his farewell address. We don't have time to do that today, but it's almost prescient of all the warnings.
Absolutely. I mean, he kind of saw the future we're living now, and so no surprises from him. It's just, you got to believe that the government is working on your behalf. Otherwise, we're all going to just go our separate ways,
right?
And it will be chaos.
Yeah, and be the worse for it.
Yep.
Okay, Amy, are you there, or should we keep yakking? Or
we are here. I think Janet is going to ask the first question from the chat or the Q&A.
Let's see. We have a question from Kathy, and she asks, do you see any similarities between Washington's tour and Lincoln's train trip to Washington during the 13 days prior to his inauguration?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, a lot of similarities, and in fact, some actual overlap during Lincoln's. This was by train. He stops in Trenton and gives a very moving speech about the importance of Washington to him, especially in his youth, when he read Parson Weems' biography of Washington, and alludes to the fact that how Washington at Trenton turned the revolution around, and connects that dot with where the country is there, and that with this disunion, hopefully we can do a Washington and pull a victory out of what looks like potential defeat. And so there's a lot of similarity there, different modes of transportation, but presidents who use their travels to connect with the people as best they can. And by the way, there's a great book about Lincoln's tour called Lincoln on the Verge by Ted Widmer, which I think I actually is something I refer to in the book, because there certainly are similarities with that.
So Madeline asked, did the increase in social justice awareness, like the Black Lives Matter protests, affect how you approached Washington and slavery?
Well, I would say it. All of the issues that came up with Black Lives Matter and all of that were latent as Melissa and I were making our way across the country following Washington. But what they did was put them in bold relief in a way, and it sometimes felt like when I was working on this book and talking about the kinds of things Peter and I were just discussing, it felt like kind of a red hot vector into the molten soul of America, that this was something Washington had dealt with. This is something we are dealing with. And, and so there was a real sense of urgency It was, at times it felt like, the country was, everything was changing so much. How could I freeze this into any, how could I finish the book with so much happening around us? I finished the book in September of 2020, just before the presidential election, and feeling, feeling like we were on the verge of something. And that's kind of what America's always about. We're always on the verge of yet another catastrophe or challenge. Washington experienced that. We're experiencing today. And believe me, future generations will continue to experience that kind of often terrifying sense of everything shifting around us.
If I could add, and I think Nat already alluded to that, that Black lives certainly mattered and are what helped Washington to grow beyond the views of his community, where there were, if I'm not mistaken, close to 5,000 Black Americans in the Revolutionary Army.
Yeah, no, and it was,
lives mattered in enormous ways. And
absolutely, yeah, and no, and the closest person to closest person to him, other than Martha, was Billy Lee, his enslaved manservant, who that literally shadowed him every day and minute of the American Revolution. They were as close as two people can be. And Billy desperately wanted to be with Washington in his inauguration. Unfortunately, he had his knees had given out, and he didn't get to New York until too late. But so it's a complicated legacy when it comes to Washington.
We have a question from Paul that kind of butts up against that. And we just celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, and he wants to know if your attitudes towards Native American Indians has changed, or writing the book has changed your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, Mayflower for me was the book, and Abram's Eyes, about the Native legacy of Nantucket, were the two books where I really dove into that, and where I felt like enough of the mythic pilgrims we grow up with. Let's see what the true consequences were to the Native Americans in America, and particularly New England, when it came to the terrible war that was fought 50 years after the landing of the Mayflower. And so, those were issues I had, very much taken very seriously and investigated. But when it was following Washington, he had, he met with Native peoples, particularly in South Carolina, and it was there that I in that meeting where I talk about his mixed legacy there. I mean, as in the Revolution, he maps out a campaign against the Iroquois in northern New York, who had sided with the British, burning dozens of villages. And yet, by the end of his administration, the Iroquois had come to see him as a friend to their people. This is the tangled legacy of Washington. And so, it's something that is, it's being worked out today. It was there at the very beginning. And once again, Washington is someone who can see the right path. Doesn't mean he always is there. But it was this for Melissa and I, the journey was a way to really, talk to Native Americans about the Washington legacy in a very, very concrete way.
Yeah, I would add again, just as with slavery, Nat points out the inconsistent, sometimes contradictory behaviors of Washington. As a man trying to struggle beyond the views of the society in which he lives.
Yeah.
And also wealth, and the accrual of wealth plays a role in both instances. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
It's good. Our next question.
Okay, so this is sort of still along the lines of Washington and being a slave owner, but the question is, given Washington's ownership of slaves and the recent trend to dismantle monuments of former slave holders, do you see a scenario where there would be a push to remove statues of Washington like the one in Boston Public Garden?
I mean, yeah, that's a potential path. I think it's, when it comes to statues, I think it's up to the community those statues are in. And, I think, Washington is someone who, as we've been discussing, his record isn't perfect, but ultimately he came down for the principle that unites us as a country. And so, but once again, when it comes to the statues, it's up to the people who have to live with those statues. When I'm going to be speaking in Richmond next week, and when we visited Richmond, the Confederate monuments were still standing. It's different now, and people say, well, aren't we losing our history when we lose one of these monuments? And, I don't see it that way. Because in the book, I say, well, look at what happened when the Constitution when the Declaration of Independence was first read in New York City. Group of citizens flood the Bowling Green in downtown Manhattan and pull down the equestrian statue of King George, and which is ultimately melted down into musket balls used against the British Army. And you can go the Bowling Green now. The fence that was around that statue still remains. And when that statue came down, we weren't losing history. History was being made. And I think that same attitude needs to, is relevant today.
Once again, may I add something that I think it's in chapter 14. You talk about history and its importance, and we're now in a point. History has to have truth. And we are looking at places all over our country from both sides that are trying to manipulate history to current views. And I think that's a terrifying process in our country. And it, once again, gets back to partisanship.
Yeah. And one of the things I say in the book about, these issues is, history is not static. It doesn't sit on a pedestal. It's dynamic. At one point, I talked to a history tour guide in Providence who was showing me where there used to be an auction block in downtown Providence, and how the study commissioned by Ruth Simmons at Brown University about the university's relationship to slavery, how that broke all the ice when it came to people's perceptions of not just Providence, but Rhode Island's relationship with slavery. And that's just it. History keeps breaking the ice, and it doesn't sit on a pedestal like a statue. And that you're getting at history changes as society changes, and we look to the past with different points of emphasis. It doesn't mean we change the past.
Right.
We just have a different perspective on it.
Right.
Wyatt wants to know if Washington had a sense of humor.
Did Washington have a sense of humor? Well, Washington was not a backslapper. Small talk was anathema to him, but he did have a sense of humor, and he loved a good joke. He really did. I mean, one of the things that I found humorous about him, he had tremendous patience when it came to all of the pageantry of these tours. When he would, ride into a city or a town, and then there'd be a ceremonial dinner, and then all these toasts, followed by cannon blasts and all that. But what he hated was when he would get a military escort, and the cavalry would lead him in, because it would kick up clouds of dust, and he just hated that. And so he developed an interesting strategy. They would, that night he would say, well, I'm planning on leaving at 10 o'clock. So you should show up at 10 to escort me out. And then he would leave at 8 a.m. and leave unescorted. And so, I mean, that's not Washington telling a joke, but it's Washington having some fun with people, as he's, basically just trying to be able to breathe as he leaves a town.
So in your remarks, you mentioned Lafayette. And so there's a question here. It says, I've always been intrigued by the relationship of Washington and Lafayette. How compatible were they, and did they get on?
Yeah, they were completely different types of people. Lafayette was young and, passionate and would talk your ear off. Washington was laconic, kept his emotions to himself, would stand there with grandeur. So they were very different temperaments, but they're absolutely compatible people. Lafayette had lost his father very early on. He comes over and he's in his early 20s, and he latches on to Washington as a father figure. And Washington, who had no children of his own, latches onto Lafayette as the son he's never had. And so the letters they would write are terrific. And during Washington's tour, there were several times in his presidency early on when he almost died of a variety of ailments. And it became clear to him that the presidency just might kill him because of the lack of exercise he was getting and the pressures of the office. And after his second near fatal bout with illness, Lafayette writes this letter saying, oh my God, your health is a sacred concern of not just you, but your nation. You've got to get out there and get the exercise you're used to. They just had this wonderful sort of back and forth. And we were talking about slavery, and Lafayette was an abolitionist, and at one point challenges Washington that the two of them should invest in a plantation, free the enslaved workers, and allow them to run it as free farmers, as a lesson to the country as to what would happen if slavery should end. Washington said it's a great idea. Lafayette had all the money in the world. Washington didn't really. I mean, we think of him as this immensely rich man. He had all of this land, but Mount Vernon lost money every year. He had very little cash. He actually needed a sort of desperation loan before he left for president, just to pay his bills in Alexandria. And it never happened. But Washington and Lafayette's mutual love remained unwavering throughout Washington's lifetime.
Okay, let's see. We have a question from Olivia. Would you ever consider profiling Robert E. Lee in depth? He's so controversial now, of course, for good reason, but also went into a terrible time in our country with conflicted views.
Yes. Well, and remember, there's a relationship between Robert E. Lee and Washington. His step-grandson, Washi Custis, was the father was Robert E. Lee's father-in-law. He was the father of Lee's wife. And so there is a real direct line from Washington to Robert E. Lee. I think Robert E. Lee would have broken Washington's heart by, Lincoln approaches him to be the commander of the Union forces, and he instead goes with the Confederacy. He's a fascinating figure. I've got the gold rush ahead of me, and when I get to the other side of that, who knows? But all suggestions are appreciated, because I'm never quite sure what will be after the next book. So we'll see.
Speaking of the gold rush, can you just give us like a quick 2-sentence synopsis about how you're approaching telling that story?
Yeah, well, what fascinating, I wrote a book called The Last Stand about the Battle of Little Bighorn, and it was 4 years of research and really enthralling. I just loved learning about the West, having written about the wilderness of the sea. To go west was extraordinary for me, particularly when one of the reasons I wanted to write that book after writing Mayflower was I was so frustrated by the lack of evidence for the native side in writing Mayflower. When it came to writing about The Last Stand at Little Bighorn, there was a whole different level of evidence when it came to the native side. And I wanted to really explore that conflict in the context of what I had just experienced when it came to the 17th century American history. And so I want to go west again. I miss it. And so this gives me that opportunity. And but what really fascinates me is the phenomenon of California, and how it is, the collision of countless cultures and ethnic groups, Anglo-Americans to, Asian, Hispanic people, African-American, Native American, which is a huge part of the story. And this whole sense that with the gold rush, up until then, the American dream was to be just like your parents, have that farm and eke out that good life. But with the gold rush, suddenly people said, wait a minute, I can do better than my parents. I can head west for 2 years, make enough that I'll be rich for the rest of my life, and come back and be the big person in town. Now, that happened for very few people, but that was the lure. And it created this sense of, you don't necessarily, America isn't just about finding that land for the farm. It's about these vast distances that you cross because you want to get something, And so, so what excites me is yes, the Nantucketers got there by going around the Horn, but the many of the 49ers went by land. Melissa and I have already retraced the California Trail from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento. They also traveled by steamship to the Isthmus, and then another steamship to San Francisco. And so it's going to be a broad canvas, and I'm really looking for excited about as trying to incorporate as many different perspectives as possible at getting this, it's just a fascinating, for me, phenomenon, and I'm looking forward to it.
Wow, excellent. I'm looking forward to reading it. So let's make this the final question of the night, and it's near and dear to my heart because it's a writer question. The question is, the book shows a wonderful humor. Was the writing process markedly different from your other books?
Yeah, it was, in that half of it was the research that I do, the kind of research I do with any book. But, I became a writer as a journalist, as I worked for a sailing magazine for 4 years. And so this gave me a chance to return to journalism because we were speaking to people every day as we made our way following Washington. I was interviewing people. And so I had a reporter's notebook, and I would after, we'd roll into the next dog-friendly hotel around dusk and have dinner. And then I would spend the night transcribing my notes. And then we'd head out the next morning. And so it was, for me, it was just a really fun chance to combine modes of the historian and the journalist. And then there's also the travel writer, and there's a bit of the memoir as well in this. And so one of my other favorite books to write was Why Read Moby Dick? And I, in a similar kind of, a more familiar voice, using different kinds of, in that book, I refer to my favorite movie of all time, This Is Spinal Tap. I also refer to that in Travels with George. And Rob Reiner should, I hope, take an interest in my work, but I don't know if that is the case. But this book was fun because I felt like I knew what I wanted to say sometimes, and I didn't feel limited in terms of the tone. I could say some things that were kind of a little outrageous. And sometimes, it felt like, it was fun. It was really fun for me. It was kind of edgy, a way to be personal, and yet look into the darkness of Washington and slavery, and so modulating the tone and the mood. And so it was a fun challenge as a writer. I really enjoyed working on this book.
Yeah, and it was nice to follow along with Melissa too.
Yes, well, and she has a distinct voice in this book, which anyone who knows our relationship will recognize, where I have a tendency to get very enthusiastic and just go for it. Well, Melissa says, "No, wait a minute. How are we going to actually do this?" And so it was a very good melding of different strengths and weaknesses as far as, her organizational side was absolutely necessary if we were going to make this thing work over the process of a year and a half of travel.
That's a lot of time together in a car.
Yes, it is, especially with a dog.
Well, I want to thank both you and Peter again for coming to see us tonight, talking about your book. And, do you have any final words for us before we close?
I just, my final words are, Travels with George can also be construed as a love letter to libraries. The Atheneum was tremendously important to me as a young parent. This was my refuge, and you go to Newburyport. The house Washington stayed in is now the Newburyport Public Library. Yes, Washington slept here in the periodical section.
Excellent.
Even before I left, I sent. I contacted as many libraries and historical societies in all the towns Washington visited as possible, and so the level of cooperation I got from librarians was just amazing. And so, in parting, I'm very proud to be on the Atheneum board. I'm just thrilled that we were able to do this event. But ultimately, libraries are absolutely critical. They were critical to me in writing this book. And this is a library that if you live on Nantucket or you have any love of the island, please support the Nantucket Atheneum.
Thank you, Nat.
Sure.
My final comment is not all of you, I guess, are blessed to have Nat as a friend, but please read these books. George and others, they're terrific. And so enjoyable and thought-provoking.
Thank you, Peter.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, I think we'll end it there and wish everyone a good evening, and to be continued until the next book of yours comes out, and then we'll have you back.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Go Sox.
Yeah, go Sox.